Welcome to Extropy on Air, the podcast from Extropy Advisors, where we dive into the world of AI, digital transformation, and the future of business. Each episode will bring you perspective from leaders, innovators, and experts across industries, all focused on helping organizations and, more importantly, people thrive in a changing world. Let's get started. Welcome back to Extropy on Air. Glad you all were joining us again today. I'm Kevin Zirkle with Extropy Advisors and happy to have with me Mike Jasper, the Vice President here at Extropy. Mike, I'm excited about this discussion. If you guys have been listening, the first two episodes that we started in this series we've kicked off introduced a different way of thinking about transformation. We talked a little bit in that first episode about the concept of entropy or corporate entropy, which is natural drift towards disorder within an organization. We came back in the second episode, we introduced the concept of extropy. And that's really the deliberate design of coherence that turns complexity into advantage for organizations. So today, we're actually going to challenge something that sits right at the center of how most organizations think about transformation. It's a word that's been around for a long time, but it's that classic buzzword, digital. Most enterprises, digital transformation has really become synonymous with technology. I think it's about new platforms or new tools or new capabilities. But Mike, I want to get into this episode, and I'm going to hit you with a bit of an uncomfortable truth. I'm going to make the assumption, or I'm going to make the statement that says technology is often the least important part of transformation. What do you think about that?
Kevin, we've always looked at it as people, process, purpose. And that's really a departure for a lot of people where they're used to hearing people, process, technology. But we switched the technology for purpose. And every time we say that to a leadership team, there's a pause in the room. That's usually because on the surface, it sounds very counterintuitive, especially when you've invested hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars into platforms, AI tools, automation, analytics. But when you start unpacking that experience, the customer's gone live, they've rolled these systems out, and yet still things feel harder than they should feel.
Yeah, that's a pretty common phrase. We hear it all too often, that whole shouldn't be this hard, right?
Exactly. And that's usually the first signal that the issue isn't technology, it's the structure. Because good technology rarely makes things harder, but it does make existing problems way more visible.
Yeah, and it actually ends up making them faster too. You get that old adage of being able to do the wrong things faster than you were ever able to do them. And that's not a comfortable place for folks.
Exactly. And that's the discomfort that leaders are feeling. It isn't because technology failed. It's because the system is sitting in a way that it wasn't designed to be supported. We've automated bad practices. We haven't optimized our process.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of what I want to get in and really unpack today, because if we can break the myth that technology is really the center of every transformation, we can start focusing on what actually drives change for the client. So if we could, let's start with how we got here and this whole concept of why did digital become the centerpiece of transformation? What are your thoughts on that, Mike?
I mean, that part's pretty simple, Kevin. Technology gives leaders something concrete to anchor their project to. You can budget it. You can put a timeline on it. You can assign owners to the product. It feels controllable. It's one of the knowns in a project. But there's also something else going on. Technology can help organizations avoid some of those harder conversations that should be happening.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Because honestly, once you move beyond technology, you start getting into the real questions. I mean, these questions are, who actually owns this process end to end? That's difficult for some companies. You get into things like, why do we have three definitions of the same metric? We hear that one a lot. And then, why did two teams make the same decision differently? I mean, those are really uncomfortable questions when you get in and start asking those of organizations and really them asking themselves some of these questions.
Yeah, 9 times out of 10, they don't have clean answers for those. So, instead organizations focus on what they can control. They buy platforms, they implement workflows, they institute dashboards, and it all creates this feeling of progress in the organization.
Yeah, and actually, let's stay on that for a second. That feeling of progress, because
Yeah.
I think honestly that's one of the most dangerous dynamics that we see in digital transformation. That there's this moment in almost every transformation where somebody in leadership feels like things are moving in the right direction. The system is live, the dashboards are active, the reports look a little bit cleaner maybe than they used to, but underneath of that, nothing fundamental has really changed within the organization.
It's almost like there's visible progress with invisible stagnation. You can see activity, you can measure some outputs, but the underlying process hasn't improved. Decisions are still slow, expectations are still high, people are still relying on those Excel spreadsheets, tribal knowledge. There's still that workaround going on in the organization.
Yeah, that's what's tricky. I mean, is that most executive reporting, it reinforces the illusion, if you will. So, because you're measuring implementation metrics, things like adoption rates or number of transactions you might process, what your cycle times look like, but you're really not measuring that concept of coherence that we talked about a little bit earlier.
Exactly. You're not asking, did this project reduce friction across the system? You're asking, how well are we using the tool? And those are very different questions.
Yeah, without a doubt. Actually, it kind of leads me to one example. I know we worked with a finance organization that had fully implemented an AP automation platform. And on paper, it was successful. I mean, quite honestly, but there were high automation rates, there was strong throughput. But as we started to look closer, the team had really built an entire shadow process to manage exceptions. So yeah, invoices were flowing through the system, but the complexity really had just moved somewhere else in the organization.
Kevin, that's a perfect example. The system looked very efficient. All the dashboards were green. But the organization itself really didn't see any efficiency gains. There was no time save. The team was still working overtime. They were still asking for more headcount to be added. And that can be the illusion of digital. It can make systems look clean while it's actually making more work or more fragmented work on the back end.
Yeah, and I'd love to get a little bit more from that particular topic. So let's kind of go back to that core idea that we talked about first. I'd kind of love to get your thoughts on why you think that technology is really the least important part of the transformation project.
Yeah, I look at technology as the final layer. It's not the foundation. Maybe back when we had, ERP software was new, that was a different story. But really today, technology should sit on top of decisions that have already been made about how the organization and how the process should be optimized. If those decisions are inconsistent, technology won't scale consistently. It'll be very inconsistent as well. If those decisions are unclear, it's going to create confusion when you start scaling that rollout. That process, that people aspect, that purpose are going to be the foundation that the technology is going to enable.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And honestly, that's why sometimes we see organizations going through all these upgrades of their platforms that they have, but they never really see proportional value that was associated with the investment. I think part of that reason is they're really just changing the surface. They're not truly redesigning the system that sits underneath of it.
Exactly. And there's another layer to this too. You got to remember technology is finite. It has defined capabilities. Organizational behavior is dynamic. It evolves, it adapts, it creates these workarounds in the organization. And if the system isn't designed to account for that behavior, technology is always going to lag behind reality.
Yeah, that's a really important point because that transformation, like you mentioned, it's not just technical, it's behavioral. And behavioral is always going to find a way. I mean,
E-
that's the reason we see so much shelfware out there, right?
Every single time.
Yeah. So let's go back and kind of revisit the framework that we had introduced previously, Mike. You remember that concept of structure, system, technology all put together? I think this is where things really start to click for people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, structure defines how decisions are made and who owns each piece. The
Yeah.
system defines how things flow, how the information moves. Technology then enables that and scales it at system. Most organizations are inverting this. They start with technology, then they try to retrofit their system and their structure around the technology.
Yeah, almost backwards. And I know some of our builder clients might appreciate this. It's kind of like trying to build that house, but starting with the roof instead of the foundation, right?
Exactly. When you do that, everything underneath becomes reactive. And you're constantly adjusting processes to fit the tool instead of designing the tool to support the process.
Yeah, and that's at the end of the day, that's where you're going to see your friction really show up. I mean, people saying things like, "Yeah, this system won't let me do that," or we have to work around this step. I mean, I think anytime you hear something like that within your organization, you know that, I mean, these are signals that technology is dictating behavior instead of enabling it, right?
Yeah. And over time, those workarounds are going to accumulate, which brings us right back to our entropy.
Yeah. And speaking of entropy, we spent a lot of time on that one in the first episode in here. And if I could, I just got to pause for a second because for our listeners out there, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, we've invested heavily in technology, but something still feels off. Like so many concepts we discuss in this podcast, you're not alone if you're feeling that way. This is exactly where we spend a lot of time with leadership teams at Extropy Advisors. So if you would like, I encourage you all to go check out getextropy.com. You can learn a little bit more about how we can help you assess where your transformation might be breaking down, whether it's at the structural level or the system level, not just the technology layer. And if this conversation is resonating, please make sure to subscribe, share this podcast with others on your team. Each episode we do, we try to build it on the last ones. Appreciate you guys listening. Let's talk about kind of failure patterns, if you will. Where do you see organizations consistently go wrong when they center transformation around the technology?
I think one is one that we've already hinted on already. Yeah, I call it the tool first thinking. They start with a solution and they go looking for a problem that can solve.
Instead of starting with the system they're trying to design, right?
Yep, exactly. Another one is fragmentation through success. And what I mean there is different teams successfully implement different tools, but no one's responsible for how those tools work together. So the success is at a local level. It creates complexity at the enterprise level. Each group is working fine, but the company itself isn't seeing those benefits due to extra work between departments.
Yeah. I like the way you put that. I think that's a great way to say it. Fragmentation through success. I mean, nobody feels like they're failing, but the organization as a whole, it just becomes a lot harder to operate in those scenarios.
Yeah. And I think the third is over reliance on the integration as a fix. Leaders assume that just because systems are connected, coherence will follow. But integration connects data. It doesn't align decisions. If you're working with one set of data, completely different with different use cases than in another system, it's going to create complexity all over again.
Yeah, and actually hit on one of our key words there in that last phrase. I'll kind of set you up with a softball here. If technology isn't at the center of that transformation, Mike, what is?
It's the coherence, the purpose. I think that's really what needs to be at the center. Transformation should be centered on how decisions are made, how the information flows, how accountability is structured. Everything else should support that.
Yeah, and I think this is really where that shift happens. I mean, you get from thinking about transformation as something you implement to thinking about transformation. It really is something that you design.
Yeah, and you maintain, because coherence isn't a one-time achievement. It's something you reinforce continuously. Like we said, business changes, processes change, regulations change, mergers and acquisitions happen. We have
Yeah,
to be adaptive as we go through and really vigilant around our coherence.
yeah, and just to bring us back to now Extropy, kind of that episode 2, if you were listening earlier in the series, because extropic organizations don't just improve. I mean, they improve in a way that makes future improvement easier. I mean, it really is a compounding effect when you think of it that way.
And once you actually experience that, it's so hard to go back to the old way.
Yeah, without a doubt. So maybe what we can do, Mike, I know we try to do this in most episodes, but let's try to make it a little bit actionable for our listeners here. If you're a leader listening to this, what do you do differently, kind of starting next week, if you're finding yourself in one of these transformational stages within your own organization?
Yeah, I think the first thing is take a pause. Before the next technology decision, ask yourself, what system are we trying to create here? Take that information. Second, identify where your organization is compensating for weak structure. Where are we putting band-aids on things? Where are we expecting technology to fix something that's process based? I'd say third, map out decision friction. Where do decisions slow down? Where do things get escalated unnecessarily? What produces inconsistent outcomes? Fourth, redefine success metrics. This is something we talk about at Extropy all the time. Start measuring clarity, alignment, coherence, and do so in a quantitative and qualitative way.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. So, maybe what we'll do is let's just kind of bring it all together. Some of the things that we've been talking about. Digital transformation. It has been framed as a technology journey, but at the end of the day, technology is not the driver. It's really just the amplifier, and it's what's amplifying lacks coherence. The outcome is always going to fall short in those types of scenarios.
Yeah, the real work is in system design, defining how the organization operates, how decisions are made, how information flows. Technology supports that. It doesn't replace that.
Yeah. Well said. And I think this is great, Mike. I appreciate you hopping on with me. We've got a lot built up, and we've got some plans as we move forward in this series. And I think in our next episode, we're going to try to make things very real for some of you finance leaders out there. We're going to walk through how entropy shows up inside finance operating models. We're going to look across not only accounts payable, but we can also look across accounts receivable, procurement, treasury. I mean, where it hides, how it manifests, and how to start diagnosing it. Because once you move beyond the myth of digital, you really can start seeing the system clarity.
Yeah, once you see it, Kevin, you can actually start designing it too as well.
Without a doubt, that's the shift, quite frankly. Well, I think that's been great. Appreciate you hopping on with me today, Mike. All of you folks out there listening, certainly make sure you hit that subscribe button. Love to see you at the next episode. Thanks for joining us. Y'all have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to Extropy On Air. We hope you found today's conversation insightful and inspiring. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode, and connect with us at Extropy Advisors to continue the conversation on AI and digital transformation. Until next time, I'm Kevin Zirkle, and this has been Extropy On Air.